Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study. We are beginning a new study today. We're in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth is the 8th book in the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Pentateuch or the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then after Deuteronomy comes the book of Joshua that tells of the conquest of the Promised Land. And then comes the book of Judges that details that period of history known as the time of the Judges. And then the next book is the book of Ruth. Small book, only 4 chapters, but telling us a very important part of Israelite history. Now, Ruth occurs during the time of the Judges, those events portrayed and outlined in the book that bears that name. Now, very briefly, you remember that in Israelite history, Moses, of course, was the deliverer. God used Moses to bring the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. By a mighty hand, he defeated the Egyptian empire and delivered his people. For 40 years, they journeyed in the wilderness. And finally, under the leadership of Joshua, they enter and come into possession of the promised land. Now, after Joshua has died, we enter that period of time called the Judges. It lasts a few centuries in Israelite history. It was before the days of the kings. It was before the days of Saul, the first king of Israel, which would establish the monarchy for the government of Israel. So during the time of the Judges, there was no centralized government. There was no central authority, but rather the authority came from each of the tribes. You remember there are 12 tribes in Israel. They had divided up the land, and each of the tribes had its own leadership, its own elders. They were a loose confederation of tribal groupings. They were one nation, but they lacked that central government. That would come when Samuel would anoint Saul in years to come. And the time of the Judges covers that period of history of the tribes. And judges were those leaders who would arise from time to time to help the children of Israel at a critical point in the history. Now, I say all that to let you know that the book of Ruth historically occurred during the time of the Judges. Before the days of the kings, before Saul and then the following kings, after they've taken the promised land. So it's in that in-between time of the Judges. And we're going to see that Ruth plays a very important part in what will become the greatest king of Israel, and that is David. David, of course, is going to be the second king of Israel. He will follow Saul. And David will be the ideal king. And of the line of David will eventually come the true king, the Messiah. But that is still in the future. That is still to come. But the book of Ruth tells some of the history of the family of David. So we're going to look at one particular family that lived in Bethlehem during the time of the Judges, the misfortunes that befell them, how God was with them, and how through this family he would send David, the ideal king. And then, of course, through the line of David would one day come the Messiah, Jesus, who would come to redeem us. So naturally, in the book of Ruth, there's going to be some hints about what redemption is all about. Matter of fact, we're going to begin to understand what redemption is in the book of Ruth. And that redemption will one day be played out fully when Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of David, the Son of God, comes. Now let's see how the book of Ruth begins. Chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled. As I already said, the book of Ruth is historically set in the time of the judges. Now there was a famine in the land. It was a time of economic hardship because of this famine. There was a man from Bethlehem. We know the city of Bethlehem. That's eventually going to be the town of David. That's eventually going to be where Jesus is born. So there was a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, who went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So we meet this family, a man and his wife, his 2 sons, but they have to leave their home. The famine has become so severe they can't make a living in Bethlehem. And they hope that perhaps in the land of Moab they can get by. So they go for a while to live in the country of Moab. Now, Moab is not Israelite territory. The Moabites are some of the enemies of Israel. This is a country that is to the southeast of Judah, on the other side of the Dead Sea. Historically, the Moabites are enemies of the land of Israel, the Israelites. So the fact that this family would go to live amongst the Moabites shows how desperate times were in the land of Israel. The famine was severe, so severe that desperate measures were called for. And so this family leaves their home in Bethlehem and sets up a life in Moab, hoping to find better times there economically. So we've got this man, he and his wife and his 2 sons moved to the land of Moab. All right, tomorrow we'll start looking in detail at chapter 1 and how God is going to use this event to begin to plan for the coming of the Messiah. It all begins with this family in a time of hardship. Join us tomorrow for our next session in our 5-minute Bible study in the book